Hey everyone, and welcome to today's YouTube video. My name is Vinay Bhaskara. I'm one of the co-founders of CollegeVine, and in today's video I'm going to be talking to all of you about how to get into Columbia. Before I get started, I do want to mention that the vast majority of you who are watching this video are not subscribed to CollegeVine's YouTube channel according to our stats, and I take that as a personal insult. So when you get a chance, click down below, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell icon to get notified every time we post a new video, and hit the like button, And if you enjoy the video or you find it useful, share it with a friend, a family member. If you dislike the video and don't find it useful, share it with an enemy. The main takeaway is just make sure you're sharing this video as much as possible, as that helps us reach more people and continue to put out more YouTube videos. So as I mentioned earlier, in today's video, I'm going to be talking about how to get into Columbia. Columbia is a Ivy League school located in New York City, and that I think makes it pretty special. And there's also some other things that make Columbia really special. Columbia was actually the first university in the U.S. to grant a MD degree, so a medical doctorate, right? It administers the Pulitzer Prize and actually also has the second most affiliated, so either students or professors, Nobel Prize winners of any college in the U.S. The only school that is ahead of it is Harvard, which is also kind of true of the U.S. News rankings. And there's also a bunch of other stuff that happened at Columbia that was pretty historic, right? It was actually the place that the uranium atom was first split, though I think there are some people who might have wished that didn't happen, at least in 1945. It was also the place where the laser was invented. One last thing that's really cool is that it actually is home to the oldest gay student organization in the world, which is the Columbia Queer Alliance, which was founded in 1967. But there was also some less, let's just say, stellar things in Columbia's history. For example, Columbia didn't admit women until 1983. And on top of that, it actually was the last Ivy League school to begin accepting the Common App, so created plenty of stress in the admissions process for students up until 2010. And its football team holds the record for the longest losing streak in the NCAA football championship subdivision, which is the FCS level. And they lost 44 games in a row between 1983 and 1988, which, roughly lines up with most people's perceptions of Ivy League football, if we're being honest. So that's a lot more about Columbia than I intended to go into in the intro, but it's obviously a place that has had enormous consequence in U.S. history, and today is one of the most important schools and colleges in the United States. At the same time, it's one of the most selective schools, right? But after, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, and MIT, Columbia is right up there with like your U Chicagos, your Caltechs, your U Penns of the world in terms of being a really prestigious school. And that obviously makes a lot of students want to attend Columbia. And so it has a very competitive admissions process. Now, at any given moment, there's about 1,600 undergraduate students in Columbia, which means that only about 400 students are entering with each incoming class. And when they get to Columbia, they're really entering into one of two schools, either Columbia College, which is home to 80-plus majors, including most of the majors that you'd be studying if you're not explicitly going into engineering. So that's everything from African-American studies to biophysics to jazz studies to economics to data science, philosophy, statistics, and women and gender studies, right? The other school at Columbia is the Fu Foundation School of Engineering, is where the majority of Columbia's other engineering majors are located. So applied physics, applied math, but then mostly chemical engineering, engineering mechanics, material science engineering, operations research, all that kind of stuff is housed in the Fu Foundation School of Engineering. So when you're applying to Columbia, you're not just applying to Columbia, you're applying either to Columbia College or to the Fu Foundation School of Engineering. So what does it actually take to get into Columbia? Well, let's start with what it means to get into Columbia, right? So Columbia overall has a 5.9% acceptance rate, and as with all the Ivy League schools, it's been getting more competitive each and every year. But you got to be careful with that 5.9% number. And the reason you got to be careful with it is that included in that 5.9%, so about 6 out of every 100 people getting in, or about 1 out of every 16, is a bunch of folks who come in either as recruited athletes or as legacy students, where they had a family member either work for the university or attend the university in the past. And the reason this is a challenge, like in the statistics sense, is that athletes and legacies just have a much easier admissions process than folks like you and me who are applying in without that benefit, right? And so what ends up happening is recruited athletes have an acceptance rate, north of 50 or 60% at most selective private schools, while legacies have acceptance rates north of 30%. And together, these groups combined sometimes will make up between 20 and 40% of your incoming class, right? And so what ends up happening is when you strip out those athletes and those legacies, you get to a much, much more selective process than even that 5.9% number would indicate, right? You actually get down to about 3.7%. So only about 1 out of every 25 applicants is actually going to get into Columbia without the hook of being an athlete or a legacy. So getting into Columbia is obviously really, really, really hard. So how do you actually maximize your chances of getting into Columbia and being one of that 4% that gets selected, or that 3.7% that gets selected? Well, there's really 4 key components, right? Piece number 1 is you got to build your admissions profile throughout high school. That means getting really strong grades. It means sort of taking the right kind of challenging coursework that will prepare you for life at Columbia and also prove to Columbia that you're going to be a good fit academically on their campus. In most years, it means sort of taking the SAT or ACT and doing well on that exam. Now, Columbia is test optional for the high school class of 2021, which is people applying right now this fall in 2020. But for the class of 2022 and onwards, at least at a school like Columbia, you still should operate under the assumption that they're going to either require an SAT or an ACT, or at the very least give you a substantial benefit for applying with a strong SAT or ACT score. And the last piece is obviously your extracurricular activities and your resume and the kinds of ways you engage with your community and your passions outside of the classroom. But that's only step 1 of being able to apply to Columbia. So let's say you build the kind of profile that's going to position you well for Columbia. And we'll talk about what that looks like a little bit later in today's video. Even if you do well on that front, you're also going to need to write excellent essays for Columbia. Columbia is one of those schools where, when you get down to it, and if you just looked at the sort of raw profile on paper, the GPA, the courses, the resume, the ACT, the recommendation letters, when you kind of take a look at all of that, there's still going to be 3 or 4 qualified applicants for every spot. So how do the admissions officers choose between those 3 to 4 qualified applicants? That's where those essays come in. We'll talk more about why they're so important, again, later in this video, but writing awesome essays is critical to getting into a school like Columbia. The third piece is actually to physically apply, obviously, and ideally here you want to apply early decision. And the reason is that when you apply early decision, you are committing to Columbia. And one of the things that really matters to a school like Columbia is that the students that they accept actually end up attending. It's a concept called admissions yield, right? And so when Columbia gets an application from you during the early decision period, you're saying, if you accept me, Columbia, I will definitely show up and I will definitely attend. And so what ends up happening is Columbia gives you a little bit of a boost in the admissions process. Now, it's not as big as the gap between the early decision acceptance rate and the regular decision acceptance rate. And the reason for that is that a lot of the athletes and legacies end up getting in during ED. But even after stripping all of that out, it's anywhere from a 1.5x to a 2x in terms of your chances of admission. The last piece is obviously to get lucky, right? Even if you have the perfect admissions profile, even if you've done every single thing right to be able to get into a school like Columbia, sometimes it just comes down to luck, right? There's a human admissions officer at the other end of your application who's reading it, who's debating it with a committee of their peers, and who's choosing ultimately, along with that committee, whether or not you'll be accepted. And sometimes if you just get bad luck, if you get unlucky, right? Maybe the admissions officer broke up with their significant other on that day or just had a really bad lunch. It can work against you. And on the other end of the spectrum, maybe they just sort of went on an awesome date the night before or had a really good lunch, and it'll go in the other direction. So there is that little bit of luck element, right? It's not 90% of the admissions process. It's not a lottery that you're dealing with here, but it is, 5%, 10%. It is that thing that sometimes operates on the margins. When you apply to, 6 or 7 schools like Columbia, that luck factor gets kind of evened out across those different schools. But at a single school like Columbia, luck just does play a role, and I would be lying to you if I told you there wasn't a small sort of piece that it plays in the admissions process. So let's talk a little bit more about how the admissions process works at Columbia. I made a mention of this sort of human admissions officer who's at the other end of your application, is actually reading your application. So it's actually a little bit of a simplification. The way the process works at a school like Columbia that has multiple admissions officers and a selective process is that usually there's going to be a primary reader of your application. This is almost always someone who is an admissions officer who's responsible for your geographic area. Depending on where you are in the country, that could be as small as like certain neighborhoods or schools within New York City, or as large as multiple states in the Western US. It really just depends. But there's an admissions officer who's going to be familiar with your part of the country and the kinds of schools that are in that sort of part of the country and the types of high schools and the different high schools that are there. If you come from a high school that has routinely sent students to Columbia in the past, in all likelihood, this reader will know your high school and will have a point of view on the kinds of students that come from this high school, what kinds of admissions decisions and matriculation decisions have been made in the past, and all of that's going to play a factor. In addition to that primary reader, there's usually a couple of secondary readers, usually 1, 2, 3, depending on where you are in the cycle, how serious of an applicant you are, so on and so forth. Across these initial 3 readers, your primary goal is to win them over with your application, which happens in part by meeting kind of the baseline profile that they're looking for, maybe having something unique or extra in your profile, but then really by writing these awesome killer essays. Because the way this works is that your primary and secondary reader are the primary folks who are looking at your application, and then it gets taken into an admissions committee, which is a group of all the admissions officers, and they sit down and they debate, here's who should get in, here's who shouldn't get in, and in that process, you need that primary or secondary reader, ideally all of them, to be making a strong affirmative case for you. It needs to be, here's why this student should get in over everyone else. Not just, oh, this student has a decent profile and they could be qualified for the school. So you need them to be actively making a case for why you should get into Columbia over everyone else who's in the admissions process with you. So that's why essays are so critical, and you'll hear me circle back to them because they're kind of the one piece of this that's a little bit harder to measure in advance, but is super critical in the admissions process, right? Now let's talk a little bit about the different factors that the admissions committee is going to be looking at when it looks at your application to Columbia. So the first piece is going to be your academics. And really, this is the first piece that any admissions officer is going to look at, right? While everyone says, oh, we have this holistic admissions process and Columbia is no different, in reality, if you are not someone who they feel like is academically qualified to succeed at Columbia, the rest of your application almost doesn't matter, right? If you don't meet that sort of baseline academic almost threshold is a good way to think about it, it doesn't matter how strong your resume is or how awesome your essays are. Chances are you're not going to get in. There are exceptions to this rule, but in general, people who are academically unqualified for a school don't tend to get into that school. Now, there is a caveat here, which is that what that academic level is does vary based on your demographic background, right? So if you are, and actually your overall background, your demographics is kind of a big component of it, but if you're someone who comes from a well-off suburban environment, maybe you're Asian American or white, typically your academic sort of threshold or level that you have to hit is going to be a little bit higher than someone who is maybe from an underrepresented minority community, such as the African American community or the Hispanic community, and comes from a school district that is less resourced, maybe from a place where they have more family challenges or more background sort of challenges. So that academic level does vary based on your demographic background, but if you don't meet the level that's needed for your demographic background, it's going to be tough to get into Columbia. Once you get past that, that doesn't mean that you're immediately in the clear and you're going to get accepted, right? This isn't sort of just like a state school where, if you meet the academic criteria, you're well on your way to admission, right? Academics ultimately only explain about 45% of the admissions process. The remaining 55% comes from a mixture of extracurricular activities, which are about 20%. So that's your resume, the kinds of things you do outside the classroom, etc. Essays, and obviously we've talked a lot about that, and I've hit that a bunch of times about why essays are so important, and then other background variables. And that's stuff like your high school, any special circumstances like you're growing up in a single-parent household or having a sexual orientation that's different than what's considered the norm by society, or anything like that. All of that gets bunched in there along with that luck factor we talked about earlier. So in terms of academic qualification, what they're really looking at mostly is SAT, ACT, GPA, and courses. Historically, Columbia has also looked at your SAT subject tests, but those are test optional or even test blind at a lot of schools for 2020, and we expect that to kind of continue as they have started to be phased out by a lot of universities. Now, obviously, as we talked about earlier, this is going to be adjusted for your background, mostly demographics, but also gender and geography. In terms of your extracurricular profile, they're looking for a mixture of really high-level accomplishments, deep time commitment to the activities that you're passionate about, authenticity about what you enjoy, passion, consistency in terms of participating in activities, and the uniqueness of those activities. They're looking at a lot of different things for your resume. We'll talk a little bit more about what those are in a bit. Then obviously essays, right? We talked about this earlier, but the admissions officer has to be choosing you over 3, 5, maybe even 10 similarly qualified applicants. So they have to get to know you as a person, think you're interesting, and actively choose you over other folks. You need them to know who you are, like you, and root for you. All of that's really important. And then, of course, they have those other background variables. Stuff like, do they know your high school? Whether you have a unique identity, such as being from a first-generation household where you're the first person in your family to go to a 4-year college, being from a single-parent household, or identifying as one of the sort of non-binary genders or gender non-binary. And then, obviously, that luck factor that we talked about earlier. So let's talk a little bit more about the specific things you need to get into a place like Columbia. So in terms of testing, as I've talked about earlier, Columbia obviously is test optional in 2021, but we think that policy is likely to either go away or become much less friendly to people without tests in 2022 and onwards. Now, the middle 50%, which is, if you took everyone in the class, you lined up their SAT scores from lowest to highest, you looked at the sort of the 25th percentile, where the first percentile is the lowest score in the class, and the 99th percentile is the highest score in the class. That middle 50% is the people between the 25th and 75th percentile. So for the SAT at Columbia, that's between a 1460 and a 1550. Where you have to be careful is if you are not a recruited athlete or legacy, immediately you want to be at the higher end of that range. You want to be sort of north of a 1500 usually if you are not a recruited athlete or a legacy. Then if you're from sort of a demographic background that's maybe more overrepresented at the school, such as an Asian American student or a white student, you might want to be at the higher end of even that range as well. The middle 50% in terms of the raw stats is a 1460 to a 1550 for the SAT and a 33 to a 35 for the ACT. But if you're a non-athlete or legacy, our recommendation here at CollegeVine is that you want to be between a 1500 and 1580 on the SAT and a 34 to a 36 on the ACT. And if you're Asian or white, kind of want to be on the upper end of that range, right? That's just what Columbia is looking for in terms of students from your background. Again, if you're applying without any boost to your profile, you'd be aiming for a 1500 plus or a 35 plus on the ACT. Now, in terms of your GPA, the profile is pretty rigorous in terms of what it's looking for, right? That's between a 3.85 and a 3.97, right, in terms of the typical GPA for an accepted student from all kinds of backgrounds. And actually, that doesn't vary as much between backgrounds since, pretty much everyone does really well in terms of GPA that ends up at a school like Columbia. Now, one thing that all Columbia students have in common is that they're usually taking the hardest course load allowed by their school. And even if your school doesn't allow AP or IB sort of courses because for some reason your school has a different approach in terms of the class setup, that is going to put you at a bit of a disadvantage, but you still want to make sure that you're taking the hardest course load allowed by your school and making sure that your school guidance counselor is mentioning that you've taken the highest or most difficult course load allowed by your school on their recommendation letter. Now, in terms of extracurricular activities, there's such a diversity of profiles at a school like Columbia. But one thing that is sort of common is that regardless of the area or field that you're in, whether it's sports or science or debate, usually someone applying to Columbia will have multiple out of leadership positions, high-level awards, and impressive projects on their resume. So not just a leadership position in one activity, but a leadership position in 2 or 3, and then maybe 2 or 3 high-level awards that pair with that, and a project or 2 that they completed on top of that, right? And one thing that's important to note about a school like Columbia is that there's kind of this misconception out there that what a school like Columbia is looking for is someone who's pretty good at a lot of things. What do you think of as kind of the well-rounded applicant or the generalist is another way of thinking about it. So there's someone who participates in multiple clubs across different types of activities and, just someone who sort of does well, in a bunch of activities, but maybe isn't necessarily a superstar in any one field. That's actually not the case. Really what Columbia is looking for is a well-rounded class of superstar applicants. So it's usually better to be the superstar journalist than someone who's a generalist at journalism, debate, music, and sports. And in fact, music and sports in particular are challenging because there's just so many people that do them, so they don't stand out as much. When you're applying to a school like Columbia, you really want to be building a lot of strength in one core area of your profile, whether that's science, it can be a more specific thing like life sciences or chemistry or chemical engineering, but it needs to be in one specific area. This is the concept of like a spike, if you've heard that term before. And you need to have multiple high-level accomplishments and a lot of commitment to that one area. Then you can usually pair that with maybe one secondary area that is really strong as well. So when I was applying to college, for example, my primary sort of area or spike was aviation. It was around aviation journalism, aviation internships, business, etc. And then my secondary kind of area was around politics and debate. So you really want to make sure that you're taking that into account with your application, right? You want to make sure that you're aiming for that one primary area of success and then maybe a secondary area that you have a decent amount of success in as well. That's the biggest thing with the extracurricular profile, because just having leadership positions and awards sometimes isn't even enough. You kind of need to show off that you're going to be a superstar within your field. So let's actually walk through a couple of sample profiles at Columbia. These are actual profiles that were successfully accepted to Columbia in the last couple of years, and they should hopefully illustrate some of the kinds of things you need to do to be able to get into a school like Columbia. So the first student we have here is a white male from New York who didn't apply for financial aid. Their intended major is history, and they attended a suburban public high school. In terms of academic background, they had a 1580 on the SAT, 780 critical reading, 800 math, 4.3 weighted GPA. Their school didn't rank, but they took a very advanced course load with 12 AP classes and 6 honors classes, and they scored a 5 on 5 different AP exams. In terms of extracurricular activities and awards, they obviously played the clarinet, and they were part of the Juilliard Summer Program, All-State Orchestra, paid orchestra for the school musical, principal clarinet in their band, concert band, and jazz band. So a lot of clarinet stuff there. They were the regional champion, state runner-up, and national top 10 for National History Day. They were the secretary of their school's quiz bowl team, essentially. They were the captain and treasurer of their school's history bowl. They were the opinion editor of their school newspaper. They were part of the USA Biology Olympiad. They qualified for that. They did community service where they played clarinet for seniors in a nursing home every Tuesday. They won the National Spanish Exam gold medal. They were a research assistant for a history professor at a local university and an assistant conductor for an elementary school special needs band in their county. So when you look at this student's profile, obviously they met that initial academic criteria for, a white male suburban student from the state of New York. Then on top of that, they also had a really strong extracurricular profile with 2 key areas of strength, as we talked about earlier. The first is history, where clearly they're a star. They were in the national top 10 for National History Day, which is a big history activity. And they were also involved in a couple other history sort of activities in their school. And they even did research separately with a professor. The second area of focus for them was the clarinet. And they hit a level of accomplishment with that made it very impressive, right? Now, one of the challenges with something like the clarinet is that at a school like Columbia, there's a lot of people that are going to play a musical instrument. So you almost have to be at the Juilliard Summer level, all-state, and principal clarinet type thing in order to get a benefit from it. But this student has that level of music accomplishment that is strong enough. One other thing that I want to note is that they are from New York, and most people don't realize this, but at schools like Columbia, there is actually a decent benefit for applying in-state, and then a smaller benefit for applying from within the Northeast. And the reason for this is actually what we talked about earlier, this concept of admissions yield. If you are accepted, will you attend? What the historical data have told schools like Columbia is that when they accept someone from New York, that student is very likely to attend Columbia, even if they're accepted to other schools like Brown or Penn or Stanford or Harvard or wherever. Whereas the further away from home you get, the more likely that student is to choose the other school. So Columbia is actually harder to get into if you're from California or from Texas or from New Jersey than it is if you're from New York. And the closer you get to Columbia, the bigger the boost you get because they want to protect that yield, like we talked about earlier. So that's something to keep in mind, especially when we have the next student who is actually going to be from the West Coast. And so they actually would have had a harder time to get in just based on geography, though obviously the fact that they're going to be Asian American is going to add to that difficulty that they must have experienced. So the next student that we're going to look at is an Asian American female from the state of Oregon. They did apply for financial aid, and their intended major was statistics and political science, and they attended an exurban, which is basically like a suburban, but from a smaller suburban community, public high school. In terms of academic background, they had a 1560 on the SAT. They had a 4.38 weighted GPA. They were ranked 4th out of 350 students in their class. They took 11 AP classes and 6 honors classes. They took 7 AP exams, scoring a 5 on each exam. In terms of extracurricular activities, they won 3 local Girls Who Code programming competitions. They were the regional runner-up and state top 5 finisher for the Intel ISEF competition. They were the state treasurer and school president of the Young Democrats Club. They canvassed for a local congressperson and volunteered on election day during the 2018 midterm elections. They were a Kumon tutor and did private math tutoring. They were the delegation VP and state legislative officer for Model UN. They were 3rd place in their state for Lincoln Douglas debate and the regional champion. And they created a website that analyzed women's soccer stats for local high school teams and wrote 15 articles for a stats blog. So once again, obviously, you know that this student has a really, really strong academic background, right? Right off the bat, you know that they're going to meet that qualification for a strong academic background. And so they're going to actually get their resume looked at. If they had been at a 1440 on the SAT, ranked 38th out of 350 in their class, and a 4.1 GPA, that would have made it a lot harder for them to make it past that initial screen. But if they make it past that academic piece of it, then they're going to have their extracurricular resume looked at. And so here, again, you can see that this student has a really, really good resume relative to their intended major. And you'll notice it's not just about competitions, though that's obviously a part of it. It's also about that alignment that we talked about earlier, right? They have multiple statistical activities, right? Whether it's the Girls Who Code, it's the math tutoring, or obviously the website and the statistics blogging. Then they also have that political component with the Young Democrats, the engagement with direct election stuff. That's one of the biggest things for political science majors or prospective political science majors is engaging with local politics. And then obviously the debate and the Model UN. So as you can see here, with a school like Columbia, it's not just about having a really strong set of accomplishments. It's also about how those accomplishments line up with what you've told Columbia is your goal in terms of your major and your career goals. So that's going to pretty much wrap up our video for today. If you enjoyed this video, if you have any further questions, or if you'd like me to do more of these profile breakdowns, definitely let us know in the comments below. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell icon to get notified every time we post a new video. Other than that, that's pretty much all I've got. So I will catch you all later, and stay tuned for more YouTube videos from CollegeVine.